there has to be a very, very fundamental recognition and an embodied understanding that we are connected, not just to each other as people, but to the land, to the earth. And that can take many different forms. But I think there's something about that shift. When we are talking about about the collective, not also just a collective with only those with whom we share similarities, but sort of bringing many divergent, sometimes incommensurable ways of being together. So there is something about being able to hold all of that together and the shifts that are needed for that to happen.
Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Kira Epstein. Welcome to Commonweal New School. Today, we offer a conversation about narrative, resilience, and social change with two researchers managing grants across the Global South for Commonweal's Omega Resilience Awards program. Omega Resilience Awards is a global learning community with 64 fellows and 30 research teams. And for the past 4 years, the program has offered fellowships to teams in Africa, India, and Latin America who are working to build community resilience in amazing and creative ways. In today's conversation, researchers Urmitapa Dutta and Susan James talk with host Susan Grelock Yusem about the research grants that they manage within the program, looking at the narratives and knowledge systems used by the fellows in the Global South, what those narratives offer, and what can be gleaned from both systems as we face changes in our world. If you've not joined us before, the New School is Commonweal's learning community and podcast. We explore ways to build resilience and better stewardship of our bodies, souls, communities, and the earth. We produce our conversations and we make them available for thousands of listeners worldwide on YouTube and your favorite podcast media sites. This conversation is part of many conversations that we're hosting during this year, which is Commonweal's 50th anniversary, to celebrate 5 decades of work with much more to do and more to come. Urmitapa Dutta, Susan James, and Susan Grelock Yusem, welcome to Commonweal New School.
Welcome to the New School. The New School is the learning community of Commonweal. Commonweal has been working for over 50 years to look at healing, how we can help healing ourselves and the earth. And this year we've been looking very closely at our 50th anniversary at what is happening and how can we respond. I'm Susan Grelock Yusem. I work on strategy at Commonweal. I also work very closely with Aura, which is one of our 30 programs that make Commonweal their home. I'm very excited to have both of you here today. We have Urmi Dutta and Susan James, who are two members of the Aura community who have been helping do research to help us understand what we can learn from the project of Aura and what is happening. Forgive my short bio for your wonderful careers, but Susan's core faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. She's the co-chair of the Community Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychology program. She is co-leading 2 research grants through Aura. One is looking at Global South knowledge systems, and the other one is looking at particularly understanding Aura through the lens of technology. What is the way that technology emerges in the Aura community itself? And Susan's very interested in structural violence, transnational African spirituality, and visual research methodologies. How did I do? Anything else?
Thank you.
And we're also joined by Urmi Dutta, who is Associate Professor of Psychology at UMass Lowell. She's the chair of the Greenlee Peace Scholar Program, and she's also co-leading 2 Aura grants. One is Storytelling as Survival in the Mia community in Assam in India, and the other is helping us understand the role of art and culture within the Aura learning community itself. And Urmi is an activist scholar. She's very interested in transnational feminism and transcolonial decolonized frameworks. So welcome to Commonweal, both. Thank you for making the trip here.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I thought we would just get started by saying a little bit about Aura. I mean, Aura was designed as a learning community. We have 3 hubs in the Global South: India, Latin America, and Africa. And there's about 100 plus people in the Aura community. There's 30 research projects and 63 fellows. And we sort of loosely hold ourselves as a site of learning and understanding rooted in community-based work. People in Aura are doing all kinds of work, but we're very much connected through an interest in community-based work and understanding the relationship between that and narrative and social change. And Susan and Urmi are part of two of the research teams that have been helping us understand what we can learn from the looking within and from a kind of learning community held with this kind of intention. And I thought we could start by just a little grounding on what you both want to share about what is emerging. You're still in the emergent process of the research, but it was lovely to hear sort of the themes that are starting to rise up that you're seeing as you kind of come and join and introduce yourselves and learn more about Aura.
Thank you. So our team has been working on art and culture. And I think, before I sort of share some of what we have been learning, I'd like to highlight how we even approached the idea of culture. So for us, our team, which we have 3 members alongside myself, there is Alicia Solomon, who is here, and Iredi Bernal, who could not join us. So the 3 of us have been looking at culture as a site of possibility and also a site of ongoing struggle. So it's not something that is static. And we've also been really paying attention to the ways in which culture becomes a site of violence, paying attention to the idea of cultural violence, how different modalities such as media, ideology, knowledge production, popular narratives, that all of those things are used as a way of dehumanizing particular groups of people so that the violence and the persecution and the injustices against them end up being normalized and they end up being legitimized. So we really understand that, so many of the contexts from which, where the Aura fellows are working are contexts of very active cultural violence. And cultural violence is really what provides the logic that then sustains structural violence, that sustains other forms of direct violence. So we've been really keen on looking at how are folks on the ground contesting cultural violence. What are the ways in which they are interrupting, disrupting, these dehumanizing narratives and the ways in which they are creating humanizing narratives. So for us, cultural work at its best is really something that is affirmative, that is regenerative, that is not only addressing the harms, but also that is creating possibilities for imagination. So we understand oppression as something that is not only taking away our capacities for what is possible in the present, but also what we can even imagine. So we are really looking at art and culture as ways in which communities all over the world are transforming their social realities, but are also creating possibilities for imagining different worlds, and some of which, there are ways in which they're also living them in the present, if not in a continuous way. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to start there and then maybe come back again to some of what we are learning.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great and very much aligned with the way that we are approaching the work as well. There are 2 other members of this team, Dr. Jadel McPherson and Jaquel Agbula, who may be in Zoom land, I'm not sure. We'll welcome them to join in the conversation later if they are. And we're in a little bit of a different space. We're just kind of nearing the final stages of analyses and reflection of the interview content that we collected from fellows. So we kind of consider these points more like preliminary impressions. I also invite any of the fellows who may have had conversations with us and are online to offer their perspectives when we get to that point, or if there's a chat, or in the chat, or their own impressions or interpretations and of course corrections. I guess maybe I'll start with the idea of the polycrisis overall. I mean, our work was to focus on the role of technologies and we will offer several interpretations of technologies and the way they're experienced by the fellows in their own work. But I think the main idea about the polycrisis is that it's something that's lived, that's sentient, that's relational, and it's lived locally and experienced through overlapping and ongoing systems of violence that include environmental degradation, which is inseparable from gendered, racialized, caste, and state levels of violence. It's maintained through extractivist processes like mining, wind, solar, land. It intensifies instability and often creates impossible choices for living, for survival, actually. And we kind of reframed the idea of technology as a support structure. And that was redefined across interviews. So for us, what counts as technologies are community relations, kinship systems, ritual practices, collective governance, arts-based practices, including theater, poetry, radio, storytelling, spiritual practices, ancestral veneration, and ecological memory. Some fellows talked about nature as a kind of archive for memory that they can relate to continually. And then there's kind of we found a dismissal of the idea of extractive Western technological paradigms, where here technology kind of stabilizes life rather than optimizing growth, and it precedes and exceeds the power of the state.
That's really interesting, the emergence of the word technologies and the counter narrative against what technology has come to mean in Western culture and artificial technology and like what is in digital technology. So this idea is very like that list of technologies is quite energizing to hear in that way. When the fellows that you've talked to within the Aura community, do they actively think of those things as technologies, or was it the conversation about it sort of a deepening of that understanding?
There was more of a deepening as we discussed the practices that they engage in their work, and then practices that may be considered outside of their work, right? Such as the spiritual technologies that are informing practice, but don't necessarily come to mind right away as part of project or kind of employment practices.
Yeah. Thinking a little more about the word community, which is, used quite a bit, and just, I think, Susan, or you were talking about how within Aura you have a sense of it, the entity of the community that we're holding is a network, like connective tissue. And I wonder if you could both say something about the role of community and really deepening understanding of what community actually means in practice. Because I've found that when we traveled to meet with fellows in person, because we mostly meet digital, when we were in person, I had a sense of, oh, this is an entity, this is a being for people I had never met before in person, and it has its own energy beyond us. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit, both of you, about that nature between the individual and a community, and deepen into that understanding.
And I think something that was really profound and in many ways something that would seem really obvious is that, none of the folks that we were speaking to were just speaking as individuals, that they were so much, embedded in their communities and, and having very, very different relationships to community. So it wasn't simply, I think, when we also think about community, there is often an idea of there is similarity, there is something that is shared. And, more so, I think, along lines of, race, gender, ethnicity, that those are the lines that often tend to get drawn when we think about community. But I think what we were seeing in the ways that the fellows that we spoke to, the ways that they were thinking about community, or, was rather they were living community. that the work that they were doing was not outside of community. And there was a way in which there was also a lot of intentionality around building community, around building communities of care. And some of this really came across when we had conversations about repression, about backlash, about the kinds of risks that people are taking. And as many of the people that we spoke to are working under conditions of authoritarianism, under growing fascism. So to really, and so this is such a reality of the kinds of backlash that they're facing. And some of what they shared with us was, it was not so much of what they said, but it was how they responded. That when we asked them, how are you responding to the repression? It was more about, of course, the repression will be there, but also, we are building the communities that we need to protect us. So there was a sense in which the repression is not happening outside of that community. And that was a really powerful understanding of how the community, the grounds that we are standing, the spaces within which we are doing the work is constantly transforming with the work itself. So there isn't an end point as such, but the shifts and the changes we are constantly sort of tilling the soil, and that's constantly happening. So there was a way in which community, that there was so much of heart in community, and it was that sort of community is something that is always being made, that is always being cared for, that is being protected, and where there is accountability. So those were some of the things that came up in our conversations.
So the community itself is something consciously tended and cared for as a very organic, living entity.
Yes. And very much, people are tied together by struggle. So it was not so much about relying on categories or identities, but it was by relationships of struggle.
And solidarity and relation.
Yeah, I would add both of those ideas, that members of communities are aware of this kind of omnipresence of struggle and the need for solidarity to be able to engage in the struggle effectively. They also see community as a space to amplify voices and political positions without extraction. They also saw aura as a way of enabling kind of cross-regional recognition and solidarities, and supporting what we often refer to as survivance, so survival and resistance politics, rather than moving toward something that's solution-driven.
Yeah, I think we felt that we monthly have global calls where people come, and I think we've seen that recognition at moments, unexpected moments of recognition across regions of like shared values or something that is like energizing in what can be a very repressive or violent structure that you're trying to function in.
And in community, there are also a set of tensions, right, that raise the question of how community networks avoid reproducing the same hierarchies they seek to dismantle, right?
Well, I'd love to get into a little bit the relationship between narrative change and community, and that reciprocity of systems changing for narratives to change, and like the relatedness of those, like that there sometimes can be a sense of you change the story and the culture changes, but it doesn't really work. There's this very interconnected web between systems, culture, community, and the dominant narratives. And I wonder if you could both get into that. I mean, I think Urmi, your work with the Mia community is definitely touches very much on the healing quality of narrative and the repair, and how you might be an ally in that kind of a work.
Yes, I think sometimes the term narrative repair can be misleading, because we tend to associate repair with fixing something. But the work of narrative repair can also be very regenerative. So with the Mia communities who are in the northeastern borderlands of India, who have been facing mass disenfranchisement and persecution for over a century now, particularly in the last 2 decades. At the very core, what they have been struggling against are these very dehumanizing narratives about who they are. So even the term Mia, which in Urdu means gentleman, but the way that dominant narratives have constructed it is that Mia is considered an ethno-racial slur. And so just the level of dehumanization is very, very acute. And then, so there were many other designations that were used to refer to this community. And part of the work of narrative repair has been reclaiming the name of their community and reclaiming it in ways that are not associated with that kind of denigration and dehumanization, with the kinds of qualities of being unclean, of being the other, of those kinds of associations. So some of the things that we've been working on collectively is about relying on ancestral stories. So there were all of these stories which have been passed on, which are not part of the collective dominant narrative. So it has been a way of restoring those narratives. It has been a way of crafting stories, of crafting poetry that uses the imagery, the symbolisms, the histories, again, which have been systematically erased. And then the stories are also a work of bringing into the public domain the kinds of suffering and violence that are erased and normalized. So it is also a very critical work of documentation. And I want to connect this to what you were saying, Susan, about I think sometimes the distinction that's made between material or structural change versus symbolic or narrative change. But I think when you do that work and when you see what that looks like on the ground, it's very difficult to disentangle those. Because essentially what is happening with that kind of narrative repair work, and this is happening through digital stories, through various kinds of public community archives that are being built, what's being done is they're transforming what is reality. They're transforming what official truths have denied. So they're bringing this very public narrative about their history and suffering and about the injustice that's happening, and which means that then when you begin to think about very material systemic things such as policies, there is a very direct relationship to that. To be able to say that we need to develop policies that are aligned with this reality, so that connection between material and what is otherwise seen as symbolic is really broken down. You see that they go hand in hand. You cannot separate the two.
Yeah, to follow again, we found that people saw storytelling as something that wasn't representational, but more an intervention, right? So it became interventional. So through theater, poetry, journalism, and the idea of collective witnessing was a very important part of storytelling. And art's narrative and witness as resistance was a key theme that we're reflecting on. And fellows thought about witness as being positioned kind of as a technology of survival, of communication, of recognition, of rehistoricizing, so correcting false histories, false narratives that are used for purposes of suppression and oppression, that mobilize outrage, preserve dignity, and also enable a collective processing of trauma. This concept of artistic love was also raised as a means of transforming unspeakable violences into shared meaning for the collective.
What do you mean when you say artistic love? What is that?
The artistic engagement with story and with art making and yeah.
So if you think of the Mia example, so in a circle with other women creating poetry, telling those stories, and then sharing them out, and then witnessing each other in those stories. And then, so Susan, I hear you saying there was various examples of that same dynamic and all these different forms coming through.
Yeah, and I want to make sure music is part of that as a technology of memory and also resistance and futurity.
There were a number of people within the Aura community that are music makers, singers, and there's a folk project too. And yeah, music has a very subversive quality as well as a generative and memory quality.
Yeah.
Could I just add
yeah.
to, because I think, what you're highlighting, particularly about, what you said about artistic love. I think that has shown up in our work a lot with the fellows. So we've had, I think, we've really seen how fellows and the collectives that they work with, how they use different artistic modalities as a way of expressing desire. And a desire that both recognizes what has been repressed or suppressed in the past, but also imagine futurities. Imagine something that is different. So using theater, using poetry, using photographs, all of those as a way of of engaging with a reality that is very different and that is also transforming the relationship to self and community and to the earth. So that it's been very much replete with that. And it also goes back to the ways that you were talking about technology earlier, because we've also seen so much come up about radical joy.
Yeah.
And radical joy as, seeing radical joy as a political technology of survival. And not as something that is a break from reality or a break from struggle, but very, very central to the struggle itself. So I wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you said earlier, Susan, when I asked about the narrative that exists in the lived experience of the community, you're like, well, it's there, like it's happening. It doesn't matter what the dominant narrative, there is that joy and that love happening and it finds forms through cracks or however it needs to materialize.
Yeah, the community narrative always exists in parallel with the dominant narrative, right? And the community narrative is filled with strategy for survival, be it subversive strategy or more public strategy. It's ever present.
And sometimes we see breakthrough moments in that when there's a tipping point and suddenly there can be a shift. Doesn't always happen that way, but there's moments in history where we've seen that. I want to say a little bit about, just to flag that narrative isn't always like a cognitive or linguistic thing. Like narrative can be somatic narratives or artistic narratives. Can you say a little bit of that, just so we make sure we're expanding our understanding of what narrative actually can be or is? I think that, especially, Susan, with the spiritual technologies that you've tapped into, which aren't even necessarily recognized as valid responses culturally in a lot of places.
Yeah, I mean, the narrative that emerges from spiritual practice can function as what we might think about as a counter archive for rehistorization, and has its own justice system, its own ethical set of practices, and comes into play particularly when there's no legal recourse. Right? It also holds a narrative that sustains community memory in the absence of state accountability. Right? So it's that underlying, or perhaps it's on the top, and ongoing presence of this counter narrative that infiltrates each system where community members engage. Right? And it's not necessarily a narrative that's legible to everyone. It may not be legible to outsiders. It may be a very closed system that tries to hold the dominant narrative accountable, but also realizes that that is part of the ongoing struggle. And that accountability may never be realized. But the more of an accurate depiction of what's happening in the world around community members is what stays alive and what functions and what offers strategy and tools for survival.
I think, to that, I would add, I really appreciated the fact that you brought up memory, because so much of narrative is memory work, a memory of history. Narrative can also be place. Narrative can be place, space. So I think there is a temporality in narrative that is not limited to sort of the beginning, middle, and end, as we would generally tend to think if we just use a cognitive framework. But the ways in which narrative can also be it can be a play on temporality. It can disrupt temporality as we understand it. And I think in our case, we saw that happening through art, through theater, through music, through poetry. But particularly, I think something that really, that I'm really sitting with is also sort of, the affect, the embodiment and the affect. And we saw that so much, we saw that unfold in the work that people are doing through theater. So we saw that in the work of Chandini Gagana, who's a Dalit trans activist from India. We also saw that in the work of Eveluna Segura from Chile. And in Eveluna's case, she's using theater as a way of dystopian theater as a way of contending with reality. But I think what makes it such a powerful medium is that it's not a form of detachment, it's not apathy or indifference, but it's a way of grappling with this really difficult and challenging times that we are living through. And also sort of, it creates fault lines. So I think also, going back to what you were saying, that narrative is not simply, it's not just about representation, but what narrative is also doing is a form of refraction. So it's really, it allows us to see some of the fault lines that exist, and to repair those fault lines, but also to see possibility where, they seemingly don't exist. So the element of affect and dream and imagination, and things that would otherwise seem symbolic or esoteric are what make narrative transformation possible.
Do you want to say more about fault lines?
I was going to say a little bit about narrative as it's produced through spiritual practice, and that in many of the communities, spirituality is not an individual belief system, but a relational system that spans the living, the dead, and the unborn, always in communication, ritual, and ethical relationship. And so that the concept of what might be referred to as God is encountered through community, not private devotion. And ancestors are understood as agential beings who participate in healing, provide guidance, and participate in political struggle. There were
ancestors help participate in the political struggle. I just want to underline that. It's like not
Yeah, definitely. And there were some fellows who were engaged in creating tributes to ancestors who had participated in struggle that they were then continuing to participate in. And that prayer consistently invokes both deities and ancestors to co-present as forces of support. So sacred sites, shrines, festivals, and infrastructure around spirituality becomes a place, a center of well-being for community members.
Well, that might be a place to pause and interject something about the understanding of the word resilience and time, because I think we were talking earlier before this conversation about resilience sometimes is associated with sort of a trajectory, a linear trajectory, and maybe you're moving forward, something disrupts, you move back, you keep going. But there's in other worldviews than this Western paradigm, there's a sense of a circular quality of time, and that it's a very different orientation, and it changes how we might think about the word resilience and what we're trying to imply, and maybe broadening our understanding of it. And I think touching on the spiritual technologies and the ancestral value, this ancestral understanding, kind of breaks that open.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we think about resilience as a way to respond to an event that's episodic and where there is a solution offered or a solution is a possibility. But when we're talking about polycrisis, these events are not episodic. They're thematic, they're intergenerational. They set up a structure for lifeways in response to their presence. So yes, resilience becomes more of a mundane way of being than a set of strategies to engage in to solve an issue.
Yes, I would really, build up of the aspect about mundanity. So much of what we encountered was really the everydayness of the work, the praxis, sort of the persistence, the steadfastness, and there was a refusal to not give in, refusal to lose hope. But at the same time, there was also a way in which so many of the Aura Fellows are contesting and challenging these ideas about solutions and even reconstituting what failure means. There's a way in which there is this understanding that this is so much a process of learning and of questioning. And particularly, I want to highlight this aspect of questioning. This was something that Sungu Oyo, one of the Aura Fellows that we interviewed, he highlighted that about how, and as part of some of their work, for a year, all they did was generate questions and grapple with questions. And that was so incredible because it was not about getting to solutions, but it was about just even as a way of grappling with reality. And, so really even sort of thinking about the idea of questioning as a condition of being human. And that felt really, really powerful. So I think, some of what I'd like to respond to is that in some ways, I think the word resilience and the weight that it carries and the history of resilience, including the global resilience industry, I think sometimes it can take us away from this everyday work. So in many ways, I think when we really pay attention to and listen to what the everyday work is happening, that's where we really understand what it means to struggle against the polycrisis.
And I love that word steadfastness it represents a kind of a rich everyday understanding of just living through the times. It has a richness beyond the word resilience. I'd like to talk a little bit about violence, the word violence, and just the way that you've seen it in the conversations with the fellows, because I noticed early on in Aura and our conversations, the word violence came up from our Latin American colleagues in a context that I wasn't used to my American ear, and it shifted my own consciousness. And I almost say it prepared me for the moment I feel we're in now, just a few years later in our own country, that shift in consciousness. And I think when we talk about narrative, sometimes there's a desire to make things a little bit tidy, and that the narrative is a container or a way to hold something. But you already pointed out, Urmi, the way using art is a way to bring in complexity and violence. And I was just listening to a really beautiful Zadie Smith essay about Carol Walker's work and how it shows the narrative in art, which all the violence of structural systemic racism and slavery, but you can take it in. And I think Zadie Smith's call was like, how could you, we owe it to our ancestors to actually speak to what has actually happened and find a form to recognize what they actually lived through. And I think that's current, it's true as well in the current time. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about just the word violence, because I think it came up particularly, you, Susan, you had like a list of different violences that you heard spoken through conversations.
Yeah, I mean, violence was a pervasive theme throughout the interviews, whether it was structural, gendered, racialized, or an epistemic. People were aware of knowledge systems being targeted, their knowledge systems, their memory, and the legitimacy of both of those were constantly targeted. People spoke a lot about the eradication of indigenous languages, prioritizing hegemonic language, and the examples were Spanish and English, as well as sacred and spiritual practices, ritual practices. And so in this case, violence is presented as kind of a world-erasing, overarching presence. It's not just life-threatening, but it curtails futures. Prince Eze in Delta State in Nigeria talked to us about life expectancy there, which is between 40 and 50 years old. And, there were just ongoing stories about sexual violence, including torture and murder. And this attempted erasure that is, part of a colonial legacy of knowledge systems through criminalization and delegitimization. I mean, that we also see in the academic world of indigenous cosmologies and governance structures. And of course, bodily violence was just omnipresent.
Your example, Susan, is making me recall the work of one of the Aura Fellows, Damian, and the work on body maps, where they map. It's a body territory connection. So they map what is happening territorially in terms of extraction, in terms of mining, in terms of all kinds of other environmental destruction, and really map its influence on the body. So there is something so corporeal about it, but that's also a narrative. It's a different kind of a narrative, that sort of bring. It's a narrative of violence, but it's done in it's presented in a modality that is very, very meaningful for people to whom it's happening. And in some ways, it is also refusing so many other dominant ways of providing evidence, so-called evidence. But something that you began with, Susan, was also about everyday violence. And I think, this is this is something more personal, but I think, for me, in many ways, I understood everyday violence before I knew that there was a word for it. And some of this was my own experiences growing up in the borderlands of Northeast India and growing amidst ethnic conflict, growing up amidst state violence, armed insurgency, the state militancy and all of that. And also seeing how the region was always portrayed as one in a state of crisis. And what was completely missing in all of that, and something that I noticed even when I was really young, was the experiences of everyday people like us, and what our everyday struggles were, which neither mapped onto the state narrative, nor did it map onto the narrative that was seemingly representing all of the people. So there was something about the way that the everyday people, ordinary people, that was completely missing. And for me, that was really, I think, that was where I began to locate violence and also possibility. Sort of in these everyday erasures, the everyday struggles, the everyday denial of possibility, that all of those things are part of these very, very violent structures. So the work that we do to transform this also has to be transforming those everyday realities. And that's why the work that the fellows are doing are so incredibly powerful.
Back to the idea of the actual community-based work and its interconnectedness with all of the other things that are going on and the narratives. I'd like to shift a little bit to process and just talking about collaboration, because I think it's a word we use a lot, but I think in the actual process of how you've worked and how you see fellows working in their communities, it's hard work and it takes a certain kind of intentionality. So I'd love to talk a little bit about that. And I think just to say from the perspective of Aura, like we have found that to be, I think, the biggest growth in how we hold our very small global group. Like, how do we work together? How do we work with other regions in the world? All these different dimensions we're holding. Even this art exhibit that we're in the middle of. I mean, there is an illustrator, but there's also people who wrote the poems, and then there is someone who helped to art direct. There's someone who wrote, and we had to work together in a way where we found common ground and resonance. And even just now, I think I just saw Carlos and his family walk in, and they actually produced these for us. So we have all of these layers interacting, and none is more essential than the other to make this thing happen. But it's quite hard. It's not easy in practice. There's, you have to find edges and find the collaboration. I'm curious to hear more about this. It's a very practical thing that I think is a capacity we are needing to develop in Western culture for certain.
Yeah, I mean, collaboration is based on relationality, right? And relational ethics. And you're constantly in negotiation, right? For different voices, different perspectives to enter into the process. And so what it's not is quick. You have to have a very different
Okay, we got a few laughs. This is resonating.
approach to time. The demands of ideas like project completion or getting through a particular sequence have to take on, you have to move into a different space to negotiate.
The circular.
Yeah, to negotiate finishing or something close to finishing
And failure, to Urmi's point.
Yes, whatever the project is, it's not. It's also not solution driven, right? It's about emergence and allowing space for new ideas that might not even have ever been considered, as part of a project to enter into the conversation.
In our case, as I was sharing with you all earlier, that our team, with Alicia and with Ireri, when I first reached out to them, after hearing about this possibility, I shared with them that not as a way of putting any pressure, but just that the only way that I would do this work was if they were also on board. And that was very clear to me because we had a relationship. As Susan was talking about, the relationality and the relational ethics are so important. But I think particularly for me, knowing that what this work was going to entail, it was very important to do this with people who had who would bring the kind of care and would bring the kind of ethics that the kind of emotional and political labor that this work would require. And I thought of them, and they're also, we have been working together for a while, not just in terms of research, but we have been organizing together. We've been in struggle together. So there was something about that relationship also, that drew me to them. So having said that, I think it's again, that's not to say that you cannot do this work with people that you're not familiar with. There is growth. And there is also a way of learning about each other. And I have felt this as I have worked with you and Mark and Erin, yes, that so much of this has been, we've been learning from you, and we've also been, there has to be expansiveness in the process of collaboration. Like Susan was saying, that you have to allow for emergence. And that can happen with expansiveness. So I think, where you cannot rely on your existing relationship, that's where it becomes so much about, of moving, of pivoting, of allowing for those kinds of shifts to happen, so that ultimately the ethics of care is something that we can all hold on to. And that's truly been our experience working with you all.
Yeah, beautiful. It's been wonderful. Before we round out and go into a Q&A, I would just love to hear just anything you want to add that we haven't touched on, or an invitation you want to put forward to the audience. We have a very engaged listeners here at the New School who are deeply interested in the topics we're talking about. So.
Sure. I think, something that we've been grappling with, and something that's also been really liberating for us in the work that we've been doing, is moving beyond scales. So really challenging the idea that the local and the transnational or the national exist in some kind of continuum or scale, but that there are ways that we are all of those things at the same time. So I think something that I would like to put forth just as a way for us to sit with is, how we are constantly reading the ever-emerging transnational in some sense, but without ever flattening or giving up what's particular. So sitting with holding that complexity together. So I'll leave us there.
Yeah, I think I would say something about the importance of understanding community-based knowledge as primary and not derivative, and not always responding to dominant knowledge systems. I think the fellows really insisted on epistemic sovereignty, and if we offer that, how might that change the way we conceptualize this work? What would the work look like from a completely different paradigm? And in order to do that, we would have to accept that the knowledge systems from different paradigms are complete, that they're long-standing, that they're expansive, and that they're self-sustaining.
I'm going to open it up now to the audience. We first want to hear from Alicia, who has actually been working with Urmi. We'd love to hear, Alicia. Do you want to share before we open it up to a Q&A, including audience Q&A online?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Alicia. I'm working with Urmi and Ireri, who has not been able to join us today, on the art and culture team. I'm a researcher and I'm also an illustrator. So part of what I've been doing is kind of incorporating those two modalities together. We're working on a zine, and I've been contributing the illustrations to that. And yeah, I'd love to share just a little bit about my art praxis in the moment, really thinking through like, why is it important to be creating in this present moment? And actually just yesterday, I sat down with my cousin, and we were just talking about all that is wrong in the world. And, he's kind of more recently politicized. He's 17 years old, young, very just enraged. And something that he kept coming back to was just like, okay, how do we fix it? How do we fix it? And that's a big question, and there's no clear answers to that, but kind of holding space for that desire for the violence that we're witnessing and experiencing to cease. And also just trying to kind of guide him in like, how do we build the capacity, right, to be engaging in this struggle, which is a long-term commitment, right? I was just telling him, like, just encouraging him to write. He's a writer. He writes screenplays. He has been doing theater his whole life, really has been raised by the theater. And, like he kind of was dismissive at first, just being like, okay, yeah, but what do we actually do to fix the problems, right? And kind of saying that like screenplays are not going to save the planet. And, like in some ways, sure, like, art alone might not be enough, right? Like art alone won't defeat fascism. Art alone is not going to solve the climate catastrophe. Art alone is not going to free the children from cages or from underneath the rubble. And yet, we still have to create, we still have to make art. For me, in this moment, art is about documenting the current moment, our emotions as we navigate it. And through our practice of art, whether it's visual art or it's, you know, it's poetry, music, it's really about creating those counter narratives and that counterculture that holds us. Art can hold us in our grief. It can remind us that we're not alone. And it can also invite us to bear witness, give us the courage to bear witness to what we previously felt like we couldn't. And I think more importantly, like most importantly, at least for me in this moment, is that art is an avenue to experience radical joy in the midst of everything. And from that, we can move kind of away from ruminating on all that is wrong and into how do we create the world that we want to live in. So yeah, that's kind of where we landed in that conversation, and I'm excited to continue making art and excited for everyone here to engage in what kind of creative processes they are engaging in. And I'm very excited to see what my cousin comes up with. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Audrey Williams. I'm on the research team with Dr. Craig Chalquist. I don't think he's made it here. He's on his way here, as far as I know. So one of the things that I'm working with Dr. Chalquist on is how speculative stories can change culture and change worldviews. And so my take on that, I did my MFA years ago, interestingly enough, on memoir, but I'm a published poet. I do speculative fiction, and I should mention, I'm co-chairing the World Fantasy Convention this October in Oakland. And I just want to say that we had to bid to get the city of Oakland approved years ago, years before our current political situation. But people have been saying, oh my gosh, are you still going to hold the convention in Oakland? And what if people come and blah, blah, blah. And the thing is, yes, we are still going to hold the convention in Oakland because we're looking at it like it's a beacon of hope. When we first set out, we just were like so excited that Oakland is this like hotbed of arts and culture, but now it's an opportunity, we think, to be more than that. And it's not lost on us that Parable of the Sower was adjacent to Oakland, adjacent to this community. I mean, this is the highway, right? Highway 1 is the setting for Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. So it feels timely. And we're just super excited, and we want to make sure we invite everyone, anyone who's interested, please come be a part. We welcome volunteers and sponsorships for the World Fantasy Convention to be made manifest this October. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I've recently had a poem published, and I think it's relevant, and I'd love to share it, if that's okay.
Sure.
It's not long. So this is called Calyx. It takes the weight of the world for full potential to burst forth. We are not passive, not citrus succumbing to the squeeze, not grapes, not garlic cloves, not olives under the press. We are active, like blazing pine cones releasing seeds to grow into forests, like chrysalis breaking open to make butterfly wings strong enough to fly, like roses defying the bud with the collective effort of all our delicate petals. These moments lead to emergence. These moments are required for full bloom. The tighter surroundings close in, the faster raw essence transforms into multifaceted mirrors, prisms of strength and beauty. We are all carbon, shouldering generations of oppression. We have no choice but to become diamonds. Thank you.
We have a question from our online audience. This is from Carol. Since some of us are not researchers, would each of you mind summarizing key points in real world, real community action and activism?
Well, I think both of us kind of made the point that the real world application is embedded in people's lives, in their everyday existence, in the mundane nature of engaging with these different aspects of the polycrisis. And I talked about the ways people use or think about technologies as not something separate. They're not kind of separate artifacts in life. They are part of people's lived sensibilities.
Spiritual practice, art making, drama, like engagement in any form that it takes for you in your everyday practice as a way to resist and create.
Yes, and to also think of ways to undercut dominant systems.
The subversive.
The back to the subversive, yes. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to be thinking about, what matters and to whom. And this goes back to the point that, that they're not always clean or, like clear-cut solutions or answers that can be provided. But part of it is also process, and it is the learning. And in fact, some of what we have done is, rather than providing highlights that these are the implications of what we have learned, but we have actually taken our cue from the fellows themselves and provided stories. Because it becomes imperative on us as organizers, as educators, as activists to learn and to really think about what that learning means across difference, across contexts, and across shared meanings as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I also heard a thread in Alicia's story too with her cousin, and in the Maya poetry circles, this idea of like that making art, there's a resistance to thinking that is an act of resistance itself, but that it actually is a very real thing that we can do that has real implications for culture and our lived experience. I wanted to hear just quickly too, if Aaron and Carlos want to raise their hand, just identify themselves as people who helped develop this exhibit that we're sitting here within. Would be wonderful. The very dynamic part of a creative team to actually produce what we're sitting within today.
Thank you for everything that you've shared. It's deeply resonant with me. I understand that Aura has the program of supporting these fellows, and I understand this work as being researching and gathering insights from the work of the fellows. I'm curious if there's any vision for what to do with the insights and what to do with the findings now that there's this new understanding of other pathways and other ways of relating, other ways of learning, other ways of practicing. So are there plans for Aura to templatize these insights or take them to other places so that they can be activated?
Yeah, I can speak to, so we had 3 years of fellowships and research grants, and now we're in, for the rest of this calendar year, of just sharing and digesting. So this is sort of the beginning of that. I think creating this exhibit and then this conversation, and then we're having another conversation with Alejo in a few months, who's another lead for another research team, Alejo Deriso and the team that he's working with. And then Susan and all 3 of those teams are working on distilling their insights into a zine form, a very digestible, practical, applicable, maybe to the question from the question from the chat. Those are being developed right now. So in the next two months, we'll be sharing out 3 different zines that share insights that the teams have been developing. And then after that, there's also going to be some longer, for people that want a longer form essay style, they're also creating those from their work. Yeah, and then probably a couple other events. And also you can go to our website. Ongoing, we share stories and insights coming from people within Aura. So the research teams are sharing about what their products are in the next months. And there's already plenty up there. So you can go to auraawards.org and read from the fellows. And then I would say over the next 6 months, we have more. There's 30 research grants, so there's quite a few like products emerging, and they're starting to come out over the next 6 months, but all kinds of forms. Podcasts with younger people, there's stories, there's art. So yeah, there's going to be a range of things. So I encourage people to follow along. But do you want to add anything about the zines or the essays that you're creating?
I can add a little bit about the zine. So our team, as we were thinking about the zine, I think what really surfaced for us was thinking about the zine as a way to survive the polycrisis. So we developed the zine as kind of a survival guide, and it is grounded in stories from the fellows, which really bring up different themes around epistemic justice, around radical joy, around the importance of political education. And what we and we also engaged with those as a way to come up with questions, with prompts, which would also then invite people who are reading it to engage with those kinds of questions in their own context, either as a form of self-growth, but also as a form of collective praxis. So that's something we've been doing, and Alicia has created some really beautiful illustrations for the zine, and that's also been a part of our collaboration that we were talking about, the ways in which she sort of was really able to distill some of what we felt, some of the emotions that we were left with following the conversations, and brought those into the zine. So stay tuned.
Yeah, that one's almost done. I can say it's very engaging. It's got stories from fellows, and then there's prompts to get your own thinking going. And it is a very toolkit, practical design. It's very and beautifully illustrated.
I too want to add my thanks. I found the conversation brilliant and completely enlightening, and I have never met you before, and I want to read more of what you write and think about. So great. When you're talking about narrative, I immediately started thinking about the diabolical brilliance of taking people off their own land, which we see in this country with the Native Americans, and the indigenous languages that were so complex in their simplicity that a fable would not only give you literal directions about how to get from here to there, but go to the place where the willow dips into the water, but then would also contain moral lessons and history, everything, and all of it so attached to place itself, which I think has come up again and again in what you're talking about. But for me right now, there's going to be this whole project, apparently taken on by the county, of visioning West Marin. And I have been thinking about this. I live in Point Reyes, and I want to bring your technology, into this project. I'm looking at you, Susan, because we need real leadership, of visioning West Marin and making sure that all of our voices from the ground up are being heard and factored in, which is going to take time, right? Because we are a very multiplicitous community now, because we're not only the Native peoples that were the original stakeholders here, but all the people who have come since. And so it's been interesting to hear you speak, because it sounds like the communities that you're dealing with are mostly kind of the indigenous stakeholders. Is that true? Or are they also people that have been bringing in multiple stakeholders over time?
Yeah, what a great way, Chris, to connect what I think Urmi was saying about the dynamic tension between local and global and regional. Yeah.
I think there are, at least in the context that we have been, the fellows that we have worked, there are indigenous groups, but there are also groups who are not indigenous in the in the more conventional sense, because I think the ways that indigeneity works also shifts from context to context. So when we are working with communities, in the Indian context, for example, we work with communities who are extremely persecuted, but who are not necessarily Adivasi people, who are, indigenous people, indigenous to the land, but also that does not really distinguish many communities because just the histories of migration in that place. So I think they do. To your question, yes, there are multiple stakeholders who have different relationships to the land, to the place, and to the issues as well. But I also want to kind of bring us back to that point that, and I think you raised it as well, Susan, and you too, about how these terms do not translate in the same way. So to also even question what indigeneity and belonging means in any kind of context.
I would say we spoke with fellows who also worked with a range of stakeholders. And what that involves is often the negotiation of paradigm that I was addressing before, that the ways of interpreting the context and the impositions that communities are negotiating, those strategies are going to vary, right, across stakeholder groups. So how do they come together to the extent that they can to formulate a response that is reasonable, right? And that often means blending paradigm, right? Or in some instances, groups will need to separate. And it also goes back to the negotiation of insider and outsider understanding of the overall issues.
We didn't get into that, but that's certainly a theme within Aura and the living in an interstitial place and being able to move back and forth or between and among different communities and spaces. Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one last question.
When you were working with the Aura Fellows, they were basically spread across 3 continents, probably where more than half the population of the Earth is. And it's been amazing that you saw these threads go throughout all of them. And I'm also wondering whether any unique things that came up for each specific area, any unique qualities that happened in South America, India, or Africa that you know that were distinct? And was there anything that surprised you? I mean, you both have, I read your bios. Anything surprised you that you went into and you didn't expect to find?
I mean, I guess one thing that stood out that I knew something about from past projects that I've worked on and experiences are the influence, and it almost sounds, just sort of typical these days, but the influence of the multinational corporations that work in conjunction with the government, with the state, and that was probably most profound in Nigeria. And those challenges seem endless or insurmountable in many ways.
I think in terms of some of the themes that were that felt distinctive. I mean, I wouldn't say unique, but that they surfaced more than others. I think in the African context, we saw more explicit engagement with colonialism and neocolonialism, particularly, and sort of the failures of neocolonialism and what does that mean, what it means to respond to that. In the Latin American context, I think it was the very transformative understanding of ecology. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, that also, that reminded me of some of what I know from my work with Adivasi communities in India, but it was still, that wasn't necessarily what surfaced in our, in the platicas, in the conversations that we had with fellows. And I think in the Indian context, there was so much about the extremely violent, dehumanizing narratives that folks were trying to fight. So I think those were sort of something that was unique, that was distinctive about the three contexts. I think for me, what was more than surprising, I think it was like a sense of wonder, was that I guess I did not necessarily go in expecting, were these, these little stories that fellows narrated, which was almost like an aside in the conversation, and yet those were the ones that we stayed with. They were just so impactful, and it was almost like, of course, like why would that not be the case? But it was a moment where that just made us pause and just like completely reconfigure, how we see ourselves in the world, and then that's just been incredible.
Yeah.
That makes
I
me
would
think
agree
of
with-
the Ursula Le Guin carrier bag idea of just the little things that are accumulated along the way become a bigger story. Last question. You have a question?
My question is in two parts. The first question, kind of the foundational given that you guys were talking about was community. At least that was my impression. And I wondered what the communities were built around, particularly. Was it familial? Was it just cultural? Was it multifaceted? Was it spiritual? So that was the first question.
The fellows
The-
communities, what were
yeah.
they built upon? How did they?
I think they were built upon some common history, some sense of common spiritual practice in our case, and definitely engagement with the land and all the sentient beings in their surround. That was definitely an important relational thread through all of the communities.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo all of that, and what I would add to that is also that it was geopolitical, but in the context where we saw geopolitical, the relationship to land and history were very important. So it wasn't geopolitical just by virtue of being in a place, but it was about the struggles that they were up against because of where they were and because of the histories associated with those places.
I appreciate that. So then the second part is, they talk about the loneliness epidemic, especially Western culture. And I heard in a talk, in an interview, they were talking about that, and there were a couple members of minority communities, and they were saying, "Oh, we don't experience that in our communities. We don't experience the loneliness epidemic." And I know that's maybe not, we can't generalize that across the board, but I was just curious about how, I mean, it's not your guys' job to fix, but what advice you would give, or what that tells us, or what we can do with the Western white culture that doesn't often have that sense of community. And then, we see the shadow side of that with MAGA, and, that's how they get their community. So I'm just curious if you had thoughts about that, or...
Well,
Tools for community building.
I mean, there's I guess an underlying, a foundational idea about individualism versus communal life, right? That is more pervasive in the West, and so if we recognize that that's maybe what's undergirding these ideas about loneliness, there might be a sense of the need for a shift into other ways of being and looking toward more collective cosmology.
A shift from a consciousness shift away from I-centered into more of a we understanding that doesn't currently is not very robust, shall we say, in this culture.
Perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's also like there has to be a very, very fundamental recognition and like an embodied understanding that we are connected, not just to each other as people, but to the land, to the earth, and that's going to and that can take many different forms. But I think there's something about that shift, and not just. And I think when we are talking about about the collective, not also just a collective with only those with whom we share similarities, but in all. Sort of bringing many divergent, sometimes incommensurable ways of being together, but still being able to hold that. So there is something about being able to, hold all of that together and the shifts that are needed for that to happen.
That's the idea we talked about earlier, holding the tension of illegibility and just not trying to create coherence. We can be okay with being in a community where there's not coherence. We're not aligning into something tidy or contained that makes perfect sense to us, because if it did, it might not allow for other viewpoints that are different than our own. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation. We've been in conversation here at the New School with Susan James and Dutta, and I'm Susan Grelock Yusem, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Don't take it, 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 the river is a healer.